good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Language Lounge. It may not be morning for you, I guess. It's morning for myself and my guest, Rebecca Blouwolff. And I'm really happy. Thank you, Rebecca, for coming, getting up early and having some coffee and tea and chatting with me about grammar. So we're going to talk about grammar. And I think that's always a topic that teachers are both interested in and maybe nervous about and have opinions about. And so we're just going to have a little discussion about kind of modern, new, different ways of teaching grammar and learning grammar than I did, for example, when I was taking a language for the first time. And maybe you too. So Rebecca, why don't you first just start out, introduce yourself in case people don't know you, tell us a little bit about your teaching context, and then we'll kind of hop right in.
Sure. Hi, Michelle. Hi, everyone. So I'm a middle school French teacher in a suburb outside of Boston, and I've taught at the same school since 1998. So really, my entire adult life, my whole professional career has happened in an arc in that building. And I started as a very traditional textbook teacher. I was very proud that I divided up the numbers, the number of days of school and the number of chapters. And I taught every single thing in that book.
Wow.
No high school teacher could complain that we had not covered what was in that book. And that was really my primary focus for many years as I figured out what kind of teacher I was going to be. And then I had a moment at a workshop with Laura Terrell in Boston in, I want to say 2015, where she was talking about thematic units, but she was really asking all kinds of tough questions that I could not answer about how I was teaching, what I was teaching, why I was teaching the way I was. And I left that workshop. I was taking the train, the T home, and I had this stack of like fill in the blank grammar tests that I had figured I would grade on the train. And I remember waiting for the train because the train takes a while in Boston and thinking, should I just pitch these in the bin? Like this woman just convinced me that these are worth nothing. And so that was the beginning of a major evolution in my teaching. And I ended up writing my own curriculum with thematic units, going completely away from the textbook. And although I was one of the first teachers at the middle school to try that, our whole department is now really organized around thematic units, teaching for proficiency, assessing students based on what they can do with the language by mode. And it's been a very exciting chapter in my career to sort of be part of that work in my building and notice all the great changes that it's made for our learners.
I love that. And I think so many times when I talk to people, people just assume that all these amazing teachers, wherever they are, just come out like fully formed, amazing teachers, right? And that's never, ever, ever the case pretty much with anything in life of people that, we think of kind of having, this standard of excellence and, high quality teaching or whatever it is. And they don't come out fully formed, perfectly, teaching to all of the best practices in the best way. So I love hearing about people's journeys. And that, you start where you start. And as long as you start and move forward, well, that's awesome. Right. So I really love that. So specifically to how you taught grammar, because we thought we'd have some conversations about that. And you kind of alluded to like that pivotal moment. Right. And so let me ask you this. Did everything go perfectly from then on out? And you were now converted and drank the Kool-Aid and tossed out your grammar syllabus? Or let's talk a little bit about how change happens. Now, that might have been the case because I know for some people I talk to, that is what they need to do. They pitch it and start from scratch, and others are a more gradual sort of approach. So tell me about your experience. Like how did this transition of teaching grammar in a different way? And then let's go back and like actually talk about what we're talking about, but let's talk about that journey first. So tell me about that.
Sure. I mean, it was not gradual, and I did literally throw things out. However, I really had very little with which to replace them. Mm-hmm. And so that caused an incredible amount of angst and uncertainty. And I think for a while in my class, the students were sort of like, there's no there. Like, right. What's happening? And I didn't know what was happening either. So there was definitely like a baby being tossed out with the bathwater kind of situation. And then I feel like almost after I threw everything out, then it's been a process of kind of sorting through and thinking about, oh, what's missing now? What would I add? So I sort of did clear the table completely. But you can't actually function with an empty table in my mind. You need to have some structures and some elements there about, what's my system? Why do I do what I do? How am I making choices? Are these choices working for my learners, et cetera? So yeah, I teach, always have taught 2 courses. I'm in a middle school. So at the time I taught 7th and 8th grade, and I decided I was going to turn over the 8th grade course first. So I wrote these thematic units, and they did have some can-dos in them. And I had this very elaborate thematic unit map written at the end of the summer. And actually, I remember bringing it to the high school to print it out. And there were a couple middle school teachers who were meeting there, because that's where the good printer is. And they were like, "Hey, Rebecca, what are you printing out?" And I was like, "Oh, I just learned about these things called thematic units. So I spent my whole summer vacation writing them. And have you guys ever heard of authentic resources? Okay." And then you take the authentic resource, and it was like August 30th. And they were like, "That sounds really interesting." And then they kind of looked at each other. They're like, "We should look into that." And they hadn't been to a rhetorical workshop. They just thought it sounded cool. And they sort of started on that journey that very year based on a conversation at the printer. But what I was printing at the printer was like an 8-page document that had no lesson plans in it. And so every night I would turn back to that thing in a panic and be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do tomorrow. I just created this monster. So I'd be trying to get the kids to make these complex cultural comparisons and talk about all these interesting things that we had watched in videos. And they didn't have the structures to do it necessarily. And so that was sort of when I started looking for what is the role of grammar? And, like you, and I'm guessing pretty much everyone our age who learned a second language in school, I came from a very formal grammar curriculum. I was not like so many of us in that I was not a kid who loved the grammar. I was not particularly good at the grammar, and I was a very good student. So it was sort of unusual for me to struggle with something. And I have specific moments that I remember from my own language education where I remember in high school, I never understood in junior high, in 9th grade, which was junior high at the time, they would teach us these indirect and direct object pronouns. And I didn't understand what they were in English. So I remember the French teacher making this big exception that he was going to speak to us in English. And he taught us the whole grammar point in English. Then he tried to teach it to us in French, and I hadn't understood anything. And the night before the final exam, I was at my piano teacher's house, and her daughter had studied in Paris, and she was trying to explain it to me, but she had learned it on the streets of Paris. She didn't know why. What was Louis Leur and the two of us were lost. And I remember in high school, a teacher pulling me aside and being like, "This is an amazing essay. You have made the same mistake 8 times. And it was that thing." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't know that thing. I just don't know what that is. I don't understand what that is." And I didn't understand it until college. And I always think about that evolution in terms of we are trying to put stuff into kids' brains when they do not have a box in their brain. I did not have a box in my brain for direct and indirect object pronouns. And I'm not really sure I needed to have one in 9th grade, frankly.
Right.
But, that was so inappropriate for my level that we were working on such high level grammar. And so that's kind of the story I tell myself when I need a little inspiration or need to get the shoulders down about are the kids actually doing this? And also can kids who are this age in France even do this thing? I was just giving my students some pretty explicit grammar work recently on adjectives. And I gave them an achievement style learning check just so they could get a sense. And I said to them, I put numbers on this. Of course, I'm not counting in your average. It doesn't tell me anything about your language skills. But I figured if I'm going to mark it up, I might as well put a number on it because I know you guys love numbers. I'm not counting it in your average. But I want you to know, I think if you're, 9 out of 12, I think that's probably what a French kid your age would get. That's fantastic. So we're not aiming for 12 out of 12 in 8th grade French that everything about adjective agreement, that you know everything about adjective placement. I'm hoping this year it will start to sound funny to you if someone says une table belle, a table beautiful, and not une belle table, a beautiful table. I'm hoping that you'll develop an ear for it. But there, I am able now to see how much more exposure students need to the language before they're ready for some of those finer points around accuracy. But it's hard as a teacher. I mean, you're looking at their work, and it still can be very stressful for me when I see students making mistakes. I'm like, oh my gosh, are you going to be making this mistake forever? What's the next teacher going to think when they see you making this mistake? I mean, I definitely still have those moments.
Yeah, those are some of the challenges, right? And I think, maybe we need to back up just a little bit too, because I kind of launched in without too much of an explanation too, is that we both agree, and everybody agrees, I think, we're not talking about ditching grammar completely. We're not talking about not focusing at all on form necessarily, But again, it's that role of grammar that it plays in a communicative and a proficiency-based classroom. And the core practice, I always say like those core practices, they, that buzzword goes around a lot, is based on a book by Donato and Glisson called Enacting the Work of Language Instruction. And those core practices list, or those high leverage teaching practices. One of them is teaching grammar as a concept and in context. And I actually did trainings on this for quite a bit before I stopped and said, what does that even mean as a concept and used in context, right? Because it's kind of jargony and kind of, cumbersome. But what does that mean to you, teaching grammar as a concept and in context?
So I'm not going to attempt to define teaching grammar as a concept.
No,
exactly. Say it, I'm like, oh God, what was that thing?
It is true, right? But that's not even important, right?
It's very awkward language. It's very awkward language. But I am really thinking about, grammar as words and language that my students need in order to function in the language. And based on whatever it is that they are trying to be able to do in the language, like the can do, what words, what structures do they need to do that thing? So there's never going to be grammar showing up for grammar's sake. There's only going to be grammar showing up in order to do the thing. And I know for a long time, I understood that a verb, by definition, had to be presented in its infinitive form, even though no child can even pronounce the word infinitive.
Right.
And then all 6 forms all at once. And they had to be arranged in the way we all see them in our mind,
right.
The box.
Or whatever it is. Yes.
And so that, for me to even just be like, oh, wait, okay, so I'm writing a can do that's saying I can ask and answer questions about what I wear to school. Oh, I only need the I and the you informal form of wear right now. And we're not going to talk about the other forms because that's not part of the can do. And so really getting very specific and focused about what it is, what's like really the bare minimum you need to be at an acceptable performance for that can do for the level. So I'm teaching novice mid when I teach my 6th graders, and 8th graders, the target is intermediate low. So we live in the present tense. And that alone is a huge change from like how most first year textbooks are written. There was a time that I was teaching, the full past tense and in different parts of the past tense with 8th grade. And there were kids who still didn't understand the difference between I am and I have. And here they are trying to make these complicated recipes. So it was totally inappropriate for the level. And now I'm really thinking about, the grammar is in the context of the functional goals of the unit and what we're trying to accomplish. And so for me, that means that sometimes the grammar just shows up as vocabulary words, in a list of these are like the inbounds words that everyone needs to be able to know and use for this unit. I wear, I am wearing, I do wear, you are wearing, you do wear. And the kids are going to get those just as a little chunk. I'm not going to tell them why one ends with an E and why one ends with an ES. And there's that part. And then there'll also be some moments where we'll do some discovery grammar where the students will encounter authentic forms of those verbs in stories, in advertisements, in tweets that I'm curating for them. And they'll have a chance to see like, oh yeah, this shows up in the real world. This is an actual thing. People use these words. And hopefully that gets them to a point with the grammar where it's kind of half-baked in their minds.
Mm-hmm.
They have a box in their brain for it. And for some of them, it will be sort of fully formed from the first day they see it. And for other kids, it's going to probably take quite some time. I noticed like between February and April vacation, I have all these verb conjugation charts hanging in my classroom. Students will start to say to me, that's a really great chart. That's like actually very, very helpful. But I'm like, yeah, it's only helpful to you if you
know what it means, right?
Yeah, if you understand what the subject pronouns are and you get the difference between some are singular and some are plural. And I have taught explicitly that before. And, many kids get it, at least in the moment. And then a month later, some kids get it. And, to me, it just feels better to let them come part way through the can-dos, through exposure to the language, through everything that they're encountering. We're doing so much, in the language, with the language in my class. And then when someone notices, of course, I'm going to say to them, yeah, isn't that amazing? Blah, 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 blah. If they ask me a question, why does that end with S? Of course, I'm going to answer the question. Of course, I'm going to go walk over the poster and say, look, it's true for all these other verbs, too. So I'm never hiding the grammar from them. I'm never not answering a question. There's nothing that's like behind the curtain. But if you don't even have a question, I mean, it's kind of like what they tell you about like sex ed with your teenagers.
If they
Like,
don't
don't answer the question they haven't asked. If
right.
they literally just ask this, just answer that.
Right.
If they want to know more, they will ask another question. So I kind of feel like that with this
That's
one.
great.
Like if they're not even forming the question, like they don't need to know yet, and they don't want to know.
Absolutely. And what do you think? And I really, really like what you said about about the boxes. And I saw another analogy about a shelf, right? And if your brain doesn't have a place to put that, a context to put that in, a lot of times I think the first step for teachers is just flipping their mindset of, instead of looking at a verb form and then trying to think of can do's that go along with it, right? You look at those language functions and those can do's, and then you figure out, or sometimes is it the same difference? Yes. Sometimes it is the same thing. Sometimes it's not. But I think just flipping your mindset as a teacher, that helped me.
Yeah, no, backwards. I mean, it all kind of comes
Yeah.
back to backwards planning, which is easy to say. But then when you've, for example, in my case, when you've tossed the textbook out the window and it's, they're all stacked up in boxes that you've taped shut so you won't even let yourself go back to them, there are moments of like, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? What's the new system? How am I? And so I do think having the unit backwards planned in such a way that you're like, this is the mega can do. This week I'm working on this. Today, what I need them to be able to do is this thing, and then only teaching the grammar that you need for that one day. Like that's really, I think that's the key. Now, inevitably, I'll make a list at the beginning of the unit, what I think they need. And then I'll often ask my students after more open-ended conversation or writing, like what didn't you have for language that you needed? And then often those are things that I'm like editing into the doc later that night for use next year, so that I'm kind of adapting it to what my students have told me they needed in order to do a can do. Because I'm not always great at predicting all the language they're going to need to do whatever the thing is.
Yeah, because it all.
Doing.
So it's harder to spot, I think, in some ways. I love it.
Yeah.
And how do you think what are some examples, or how do you feel like your students have responded besides the having different, having the boxes and being ready for it? So giving them the more explicit, maybe, patterns after they're ready for it, after they've seen it and been exposed to it. What other things have you noticed as far as students' response to it?
Sure. I mean, I guess I used to feel like that there were some students who got cut off at the pass very early and were just kind of out of the game. Like, I can't teach you the passé composé, one of the past tenses in French, if you don't know the difference between I am and I have. But there were kids who just couldn't, like, in the minute translate those two and figure out how to conjugate them. And so then all of a sudden the entire past tense was just like
right
to them. And so I think that never happens anymore. There is no one concept that without which you cannot move forward, and the entire lesson is not going to make sense to you. So I think it's much more accessible. I do think for students who are linear sequential learners and who really want the A and are just like, just tell me what I need to know, that this can feel a little frustrating. It can feel like, no, but like, really, what is it that we need to know? And it's like, well, guess what? It's a little more complex than like me handing you this list and you memorizing it and spitting it back, because you're going to need to use it in context. You're going to need to use it to talk about this cultural phenomenon that we've been discussing. And so I was that learner. And I sometimes I feel for those kids, like, yeah, it's a little more complicated now. When you're doing an interpersonal speaking assessment, you can study all you want, but you don't know exactly who is going to ask you what question when. And there is going to be a layer of spontaneity there. Same with like an interpretive, right? Like, you don't know what the authentic resource is going to be. You can't just like read the whole article, translate it word for word and memorize it and be ready. No, you're going to have to like use your skills in the moment. So I think most kids feel good about what they're learning. They feel like they're making a lot of progress. Even students who are really not able to put in any work outside of class time are moving forward. But I think there are moments, kids, it's interesting, like even coming in from a proficiency-based elementary program, because our kids do that in Spanish, they will still, when I'll ask them, what do you want to work on? They will bring up things that we legitimately never talk about in my class. I want to work on having a better accent. I'm like, we never talk about that. Okay. I want to work on grammar. And I'm like, okay, how did you, it's just interesting. Yeah. I think kids still come in with the sense that they need to know certain things. And I'm assuming at some point their parents are saying, oh my God, your accent's terrible. I can't understand words you're saying. Right. Or what do you mean you don't recognize this? You didn't learn je suis, tu es, il est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont. Like, really? The teacher never told you that? Like, oh my gosh, what's going on in that room? Right. So I think some of it's coming from that. I don't know. But I would say overall, the goal of our program is to make sure that students can use the language to do things. And I feel like putting grammar in its place in this way allows that to happen. And if I'm doing my job, I'm keeping a close eye on exactly what students need and make sure I'm getting it to them in time so that they can produce the language they want to produce.
Yeah, and I think in the long run, it's going to prepare them for real life, because again, real life is not scripted. And I always used to joke that I knew the script really well, like from my Spanish class, and I knew all of the verb endings in it, and that was the context, because context can work the other way too. So that was the context. I learned things. I learned things in worksheets. I learned things in maybe the teacher directed, very, formal sort of things, but I got into the real world and I could not function at all. And that's
that was very much my experience. I had been an A+ middle school, junior high French student, 3 years. And then I went to France for the summer to stay with a host family. And I'm in the back of their car driving from the airport, and they're asking me questions and I have no idea what they're saying. I'm just
smiling and nodding, right?
Language before. So, and I think, I'm not saying that I think my kids would get into the back seat and they would understand every word she's saying either, but I think they would have more coping strategies for what do we do when we're in a situation where we can't quite handle what the person's saying.
Yeah.
And how do we request repetition? And I think they do have a lot of experience with that.
That's awesome. I love it. So how do you incorporate, so you mentioned it a little bit. So let's say you are going to focus on, let's say you've done the comprehensive input and you've done some vocabulary and language chunks and you have your context and your thematic theme. And then you do want to get a little more specific, or have them, they're at that point where they have the boxes and they're ready to kind of name the things. Maybe not even name them with names, but kind of understand them a little bit more. What does that look like? I know there's a variety of approaches. What does that look like in your classroom when you're going to teach that grammar?
Sure. So I am a big fan of sort of my own version of PACE for grammar. Mm-hmm. And if folks aren't familiar with that, they can look it up. But the idea is, you're starting with some authentic resource that is presented to students and that they're working through it for meaning. And so I really like Twitter for this. Because you can search through tweets for the structures you're looking for. So for example, I mentioned adjectival agreement and order earlier. That's something we're working on right now with the 8th graders in a more formal way. So in 7th grade, they learned to describe their family members. So I believe at that time, they saw the adjectives in their masculine and feminine forms. I think maybe a little bit of the plural. Maybe they got a little bit of a sense of the order of where things go in French. I'm not sure. It's different than in English. I don't teach French 7, as you can probably hear. And then now we're doing unit on like my look and sort of what teen fashion looks like in our school and then around the world. And they're needing to describe clothing in much more careful terms. And so I can look through Twitter and I can find examples of adjectives that come before and adjectives that come after. And then I could do a PACE lesson where they're first just reading those tweets and trying to figure out, what do these mean? So I may be providing like paraphrased versions of the tweets, and the kids are just doing a simple matching exercise, like what are these tweets about? And then after that, the A of PACE, attention, I'm asking them to pay attention to like, what did you notice about the forms? And again, what's really great about having searched through the tweets is all of the search terms come back in bold. So the kids' attention is already being drawn. Yeah, it's already being drawn to that part of the text because it's in bold. So hopefully they won't be like, oh, I'm noticing everyone loves the color red, or like something total. People wear different clothes there than we do. That hopefully they're getting on the track of like, oh, look at, all these words have different endings, or like these words came before, these words came after, whatever. And then the C of PACE, co-construction, is where we try to kind of build a rule based on what they've noticed. So I might then ask, and this is not exactly according to the PACE gods. So just, this is Rebecca's riff. I might just ask them then, which did you notice, which ones came before, which came after? And I might provide a blank table, like a graphic organizer, for them to write down, here are all the ones I noticed. Put a checkbox here if the adjective came before, put a checkbox here if the adjective came after, that kind of thing. And then that E, the extension, is where they're actually producing the structure. So I might just ask for a very brief, like, write your own tweet based on something that you're wearing today. And can you incorporate an adjective that comes before or after, like you noticed in the tweet, or something like that. So they're kind of brought through the grammar in a way where I've controlled a lot of the variables they're going to see.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can intentionally not confuse them and pick things that kind of make it easy and make it work. And then we have that as a reference. So then like the next day I might have a Jamboard where I put up a bunch of pictures of interesting outfits on the board, and each kid is looking at a Jamboard, which is basically like movable Post-it notes
Mm-hmm.
in a Google Suite product, and saying, can you arrange these words in the order they should go in order to describe what these outfits look like? And so then, it takes out, because I've already put all the words on the page for them. They don't have to work on what's that piece of clothing called? How do I spell that? I'm just giving them all that. I'm trying to say, let's take the brain power that you have. Let's focus it all on where things go. And can you get them in the right order? And then maybe the next day I can do some screenshots of successful and less successful examples of student work and say, do you notice any ones that don't follow the pattern? And maybe have kids be able to say, oh yeah, that one, it goes the other way. This one's backwards. Let's fix that. And then maybe then it's time for some more open-ended writing. Like you're going to use Padlet. You're going to take a picture of your wearing. You're going to make a separate Padlet post, which is a description of what you're wearing. And then we're going to see if we can play like a matching game and everyone can guess which picture goes with which description based on having, students having written those descriptions in a much more open-ended way. And at that point, that's where sometimes I'm like, oh man, like they knew this when I focused on just that one thing in the tweet, but now Pandora's box is open and they're trying to remember the names of the clothing. They're trying to think of interesting adjectives. They're trying to make the adjectives agree. And like, then stuff starts to fall apart. And that we have to remind ourselves that that's normal. Like students cannot focus on all the things at once. And so Tim Egan and I, my boss at Wellesley Middle School, my department head, he will often, like, in winter, early spring, he will have to remind me of this when I'm sort of panicking, like they knew it and now they don't know it. And it's like, well, actually it is there. It's somewhere that box is happening, but they are so busy trying to manipulate all these other aspects of the language. And I think, for those of us who are very familiar with the language, like we forget how much work that is. And I do think that's why all language teachers should be language learners of some other language that really challenges them. But it's like, oh, right. Yeah. You like had all your brain power on this thing. And then this other thing just completely fell away. I could bring your attention back to it and you could do a focused correction on that topic now because you know what I'm talking about. Right. But that doesn't mean you're going to do it consistently. And that part is hard for me.
Yeah, I think, and that goes back to that backwards kind of design and really, I think, understanding the proficiency levels and the performance descriptors, and that, that it is messy and they do stay in that messy kind of place for a very long time. And so I guess that does bring up the role of maybe accuracy in grammar. And how do you look at that as far as the place? Because again, I used to care a lot about like the right endings, the right accent marks, the right, how do you look at it? And you are, looking at, you said novice mid, novice high, intermediate low sort of ranges. So it does differ, right, depending on what level you're teaching. But talk a little bit about that maybe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we want to, when we create a task for our students, we want to already have a sense of the kind of accuracy we expect so that we can like write an appropriate rubric and let them know what's going to matter here. And so it can be hard if you first let them loose, they do whatever they do, and then you start looking at stuff and you're like, oh, wait, I didn't really decide ahead of time what my focus was here. So I do think it's important for students to have opportunities to do open-ended, free writing, stretch yourself, anything goes. The longer the sentence, the better. Put it all out there, opportunities. And so I do that with like free writes, or what Laura Terrell calls fluency counts. She talks about them in the Keys to Planning for Learning. And those are a very important part of my students' learning process. Is I will give them a prompt that's maybe a tiny piece of a summative presentational writing that's more formal, that's going to come on down the road. And I will just let them free write it for 10 minutes. And we keep track of how many vocab words did we use? How many sentences did we write? And we track our growth over time. So I think students need some of those open-ended examples where honestly, all I do is just read through them real quick. I never mark up the pages. And I just notice like, okay, as a whole, most students are only using this one verb for I wear, and they're not using this other one because it's an irregular verb and they don't really love it as much. I need to kind of force them to use that one a little more. Or like, even though they in theory know negation, they're really choosing not to use negation. I should encourage them to do that more. Whatever I'm noticing. oh, 4 girls wrote crop top in English. I need to teach the word for crop top in French because clearly that's really important to them right now, whatever it is. So that have that kind of thing going on. And then there also need to be opportunities where you say to students, you know, like I might say, tomorrow we're going to have a spelling test and I'm going to show you 5 pictures of clothing and you need to be able to write the name of those pieces of clothing with the proper article un or une and accents count. Now, the grade for that, I'm just going to like put a grade out of 10. I'm going to keep it in my computer program for term grades, but I'm not going to count it. It's just information for them. But if they don't get that feedback, then I think they might get the message, oh, this never matters. She doesn't care. I never need to get on top of this. And so I always tell them, the reason I'm giving you this vocab quiz is to help you be ready for something down the road where accuracy and comprehensibility, you know, will absolutely be part of the rubric, as they always are. Yeah. So I don't give any grades that count for the term that are not based on like performance-based assessments. And all of those are graded with rubrics. So accuracy is always going to show up as accuracy / comprehensibility. Mm-hmm. And basically who can understand your message. So for pretty much all of my learners in that novice family, you know, you're trying to be understood by a super sympathetic interlocutor who is familiar with non-native speakers. So like other people like me who are like, oh, I see what happened. You spelled the word wrong in Google Translate. It gave you the French for that other word. And only because I speak English and know that you used Google Translate do I have any idea what you wrote.
Right.
A French person looking at this would be just like
where did that come from?
Right? Right. Yeah, that's just coming out of outer space. And our department enjoys sending each other emails like, can you guess what they were trying to say? Yeah. And, you know, like we get a kick out of that. We amuse ourselves. So, you know, that's the comprehensibility piece. I tell them, if I understand what you're trying to say and the other kids in the class understand what you're trying to say, you are fine for now. Okay. But obviously, there needs to be a sense that you're building toward a place where you can stop a person on the streets of Port-au-Prince or Paris and they will understand you, right? So we're moving towards that, but we have to respect their pace, I think. So while the grades for the summatives that go in the grade book and they make up the term grade, which is really supposed to be a measure of students' performance, those are always accuracy, comprehensibility is one part of the formula. And I would say it's never more than 25%. Like it's never. There's always 4 domains minimum, and that would be one of those 4 domains. We do want to give that feedback. I think kids need a sense that like this is a real thing and someone might not understand what you mean if you write this. And like you have to include accents when you write in French. That's not optional. So I think they do need some like small moments of accountability, but they also need to know when that's going to show up. So it doesn't feel like, hey, wait, you told us to do like write about how we're feeling. And now you're telling me that I need an accent on this adjective. Like right. What's about? So I think we need to be explicit with our kids.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just transparent. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's fantastic. I wanted to ask you too, because we kind of skipped over. We got on a little tangent, but I love that idea of using tweets because there's such short. Do you do sequences of them then and like different?
Yes. And I've shared a bunch of them like on my blog and on the French Teachers in the US Facebook page. So I'll have like a whole chunk that are about adjectival order. I'll have a whole chunk that are about the future tense. I'll have a whole chunk that are about I like, I don't like, I prefer. A whole chunk about food preferences, whatever. So I kind of do like a thematic, whatever the can do
that's
is.
Wonderful.
Like, you know, and I'm pretty sure I learned that from Lisa Shepard, whose blog, Madame's Musings, is like a really great guide for French teachers trying to make this transition. And so it just lets you get focused. Because I know like the authentic pace lesson, you're supposed to find a story.
Oh, well, that was what that's exactly where I was trying to lead you. Like
that's not
there are challenges.
Realistic. Like,
yeah. Like
you're not, you know, like a story could be really long. It could take a really long time to get it, just the meaning part. And then what if there's not enough repetitions of the thing that you need the kids to focus on? Like the chances, and I've done this before where you write the can do, like students are going to analyze a social media post that discusses favorite media. And then you look at that the night before and you're like, I don't have that social media post. And now I'm going to go like get lost on Pinterest for 3 hours until past my bedtime. And so, yeah, that's why I just feel like that story thing is, unless you're using something that would come up naturally in storytelling, like in every story. And also like French books tend to use this weird past tense that's literary, that's not helpful to students.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I think this kind of gets at that. It's not teacher written, like legitimate French speakers on social media made these posts, but we can choose which ones we look at. And that kind of narrows our world in a way that lets us do something focused with it. And so that's kind of that's my preference.
Your go-to. What are some other ones
Yeah, it's
that
my go-to.
you tend to use, or are there other ones that you tend to bring in or be able to find?
From authentic resources, I pretty much use the tweets when I'm doing PACE, and then otherwise I'll use teacher written materials where I create a scenario, or like maybe I'll do something based on a story we've read. So we do one where we read a children's book about a boy who loves hockey and loves a particular hockey player. And at times I have used that in the spring just to introduce the concept of the past tense. And I will write a series of sentences and say to them, do you think this happened in 1946 when the book was written? Or do you think that's from 2022? And the only way you can distinguish is that some of those are in the past tense and some are in the present. And so that's like a noticing activity where it's based on an authentic resource. Like we legitimately read that story to learn about the culture of hockey in Quebec. And now we're going to look at one piece of it through this particular lens and try to notice, what's happening here. Oh, interesting. Look at this past tense. They all have these things in common. Now, in the past, that might have been then the jumping off point for like a 1 month study of the passé composé in May. That's not happening. And the French 2 teacher knows that. And we're all on board. Like, I had this very interesting, I think I mentioned over vacation, I got an email from a teacher who's in the process of making this change. And she's like one French teacher at a middle school with 2 other full-time teachers. She's part-time, and the whole curriculum is grammar. So I'm like, so tell me about French 7. And she's like, well, French 7 is the ER verbs, the IR verbs, and there was no content. It was just the grammar. And so, and I was saying to her, like, it's, you don't need to talk about the past tense at all in middle school. Like that is not, unless these kids are coming in from elementary with lots of language, that is not part of the novice experience at all. And she was like, oh, okay. So it's really an intermediate that they develop all the time frames. And I was like, no, sweetie, that would be like intermediate high at the earliest. Like that is an advanced skill. Not that they haven't seen the time frames until then, not that they're not working with them in intermediate.
Playing around with them, perhaps, right?
They're playing around with them. And I really did not understand that until I did the MOPI training for oral proficiency interviews. And I went to the high school and I said, can I interview like your top French students? I've got to find some examples of intermediate, high, advanced, low students. And I would ask them, like, tell me something that happened to you last summer. And I would watch the students. They would pause before each verb. You could see them trying to find the chart in their head, trying to spit it out. Some of it came out naturally. Some didn't. They really struggled to communicate across time frames. And I was like, oh, okay, these are like the best kids we've got. At that time, they had 5 years of French, and they are barely able to do this. And so I think we have to respect that. Yeah. But I know, like the textbook that she showed me teaches the full past time frame in French. And I remember being that good doobie who was very proud I had done the same thing in the early 2000s. So yeah, I feel for her because she's thinking, oh, the other teachers are looking at me like I'm such a schlump and I'm not doing the thing. And what happens when my students end up in their class?
And these are questions I think that the teachers very have. Tricky. Yeah, not everybody has an aligned department where everyone is kind of on that same path.
No, and as one teacher, I think you can possibly change what's happening in your realm, but you're not going to be able to change. I mean, I just think that's, talk to your boss, and if they're on board, let them
deal
do
with
that
the rest
work. But that is not something you're going to be able to convince everyone of and get on board. And plus, like this woman has enough work just figuring out what she's going to do about how she's going to teach grammar in this new way. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. You asked me earlier about like other strategies, and I know I talked a lot about pace with tweets. I would say also, I think about that comparison strand of the 5 C's, and that like a lot of time we talk about that in terms of cultural comparisons, but there's also room in there to talk about linguistic comparisons. And that is something that I really like to draw my students' attention to. So we might look at, oh, right, in English, you've probably never really noticed it, but like all the adjectives show up this way. And now let's look in French, what's different? And just sort of have that moment of noticing. I think that can help students realize this is why I can't just write French in English kind of thing, and also just to let them like maybe make some charts where it's like, okay, let's look at these adjective endings. Which of these do what we would expect? Okay, let's talk again about what we expect. Oh, right, we expect there to be an E for a feminine and an S for a plural. Did anyone notice any adjectives that didn't change at all? Oh, what's up with that? And then like, are there any weird ones? There's always like the bizarre category. And like, oh, this one took an X, this one took an LL. What's up with that? And just taking a moment, maybe like after the tweets, to kind of categorize our findings and keep that in our notes, then that becomes that like there is a there, like this is the thing that we're holding ourselves accountable. This is the thing we learned. And I think that is important for some students to just have it explicitly stated. whether or not, their linguistic system is really built to a point they can actually access that at every moment. I mean, it isn't. We know that, right? But like they have the page and they might go back to it. And I think that's from time to time useful. I mean, that probably happens like 3 times a term. It's very seldom, but we do it.
Yeah. And I think what I liked also what I heard that I always think is a great strategy as well, because sometimes it seems overwhelming. Like, how am I going to start even? Honestly, when I talk to teachers, and for myself, it sounds like for you too, it starts with me as a teacher, just rethinking, like, and just unlearning what I learned, kind of just getting away from habit and the way things have kind of been done, good or bad. And it doesn't matter if it worked for me, didn't work for somebody else, just kind of just thinking differently. And one of those is just that at the end, my students, and a lot of teachers I talk to, their students do have a product of like a graphic organizer that sorts things out to help their brain categorize and think about things, right? We just didn't give it to them first. Have somebody else do all the work and have all the thinking be done for them. And all they do is rote memorize and then try and apply. And that doesn't really
It's like
work,
giving
right?
them the answer. Yeah, it's like giving them the answer before they've even thought to ask the question. And so I do think they need that partially acquired grammar.
Yeah.
I think I learned that from Catherine Ritz when we were presenting on the core practices together. Like once it's half baked, then you can come in with a little structure and it's like, oh, this is useful. This is meaningful. I know what to do with this thing. That was not part of my process before. I used to always lead with the grammar.
Yeah.
And I almost think with grammar, you could just try teaching the can do and see what happens. And then when things start to fall apart, then you swoop in with a little more structure and grammar to kind of save the day. But you might wait until you see things that are like, okay, now we've got a pattern of error, despite them never having seen or heard that in any of the authentic materials we've used. And now I want to kind of step in and address that. And I think I used to have a lot of fears about like students' errors fossilizing and like, catching errors, like it's a disease around the room kind of thing. And also just paying attention to the kinds of things you're hearing again and again, so that as a teacher, I'm always like making little scroll marks, and then it's like, oh yeah, sometime this week I need to really readdress this thing because I can just hear that that's coming up again and again for kids. But you can give yourself some time to think about it and kind of ride it out and see where it goes initially, which I think also gives you a little more time to kind of get your thoughts together about what the right intervention is.
I love that. So let's get super practical. Let's say you are in, a teacher is out there listening. They are in a department of, let's say, many. That's okay. Whatever. There's somebody underneath them and somebody above them. Let's say they don't have control to toss out their resource, whatever that is. Whether it's a textbook or a curriculum that's a grammar-based syllabus or whatever it might be. We don't all have that ability to totally toss things. What would you say? What would you say to teachers as they're just going, yeah, I know I need to do this. I know I want to do this, but where do I start? What should I do like in a week when I go back from the holiday break? What should I try and do to start a little bit of success going, short of, redoing everything in the summer? But what do you think?
Sure. Well, I think you could definitely think about what's a topic that's coming up, that's on the horizon, and maybe look at the grammar that's traditionally been associated with that topic and kind of think about like, what's the most important piece that students absolutely are going to need to have in order for all the other pieces to fall into place. And then, is there like one authentic resource that might tie into that, where you'd want to experiment with like trying a pace lesson, trying some tweets, trying some noticing kind of discovery work with students as a way, and just see what happens. Like give yourself that freedom of like, today we're going to try something different, guys, and just see what happens, notice. And hopefully there'll be like one little glimmer that comes from that gets you excited to think, oh, this part worked. This I would do again. And I just think to be choosy. I mean, my sense is even in departments where there are textbooks, there is an acknowledgement that you cannot possibly cover everything in the book. So I would really think about yourself as the expert, as the professional who can look at the lay of the land and say, okay, given what we absolutely need to be able to do, what are the must-haves from this grammar? Like, do you really need all 6 forms? Do you really need this, whatever? And kind of choose. And I know that gets really tricky when there are exams and sort of gatekeeping that's happening after your course. And obviously none of us wants to close our students out from an opportunity just because we're, in sync with how language acquisition actually works. And so that's tricky. I think that is tricky. I also think, if you're, and I know departments are all over the place, but like if your department is in a place where they're starting to talk about the proficiency levels being tied to courses, that really gives you a lot of fodder for conversation about why are we still expecting this when this is fundamentally not a novice level skill, and to start a conversation that might get some other people on board. Because I think mostly teachers feel like they have too much to teach and they're looking
100%.
to do deeper.
Yeah.
So it's not, I think you can get people on board with that argument. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to do all this? Like this shouldn't even be our problem because our course is novice mid. And why are they asking, so there might be some ways to start some conversations there outside your own room. But I do think, like making your own world work for you and your students is the first thing. And then hopefully people see that, you catch someone at the printer and they ask you how you spent your summer. And then they're like, oh, that's so interesting. I want to know more about that. Or why did your kids score better on the Apple when you're not even the one who's teaching the whatever? There can be some ways like on common assessments, for example, to notice and maybe feel a little jealous of a colleague's work and wonder, how'd you get your kids to do that? Right. Yeah. So that can be a learning opportunity too, if there's any opportunity for common assessment.
Yeah, I think those are both great options. I think sometimes teachers give away their power of choice. Like you do have that in that classroom. You are able to make some choices on how you do it and what you do. And, I think that's a great suggestion. I also just like that you just said, just try. Because I think sometimes, as I'll just speak for myself, as somebody who wants to be really good at whatever I do, it's hard to try new things sometimes that I know I'm not going to be great at it right away. Right. And so I think sometimes our own, effectiveness and what we're comfortable with becomes an excuse, or I'm just talking for myself, like to not go out there and be
I completely
super
agree with
vulnerable and
saying.
Really try. And you know what? It might totally fail, but that doesn't mean I have to pull out the verb sheets the next day. Right. But just kind of being vulnerable and saying, hey, we're going to try this a little bit differently. I'd love to get your feedback. Kids will, middle school, I taught middle school too. They will absolutely give you their feedback 100%. But, just trying it and trying it in one little lesson. And, and I've taught, it's funny because I do talk to people, and I think it was Claudia that said, like, she did the same thing when she heard about comprehensible input. She just pitched everything she knew and did before and started from like nothing, like ripped down the whole house, dug out the basement and just started from scratch. Right. Others, I did not do it that way. I had to piecemeal it a little bit more. I might redo a bathroom, right? Or I might redo my kitchen, take some things out and kind of minimalize and do some arranging until I was ready to kind of buy that new house, right, completely. So I think it's important that teachers know that there's no one way to do it. Like you said, there's no one way to teach grammar and function and language functions. And there's no one way for you to switch, right, to a different way of teaching and being. And I think that's important to kind of just put out there.
It is. And that was really my main objection to when I went to see this Laura Terrell workshop that changed everything, was like, but I'm so good at getting through the textbook. Like I have this down, and it took a ton of effort to get to a point where I could do that well. And I was in a district where like things looked okay. Like most of the kids kind of do what we ask. And so it was like, nothing's broken. Why are we trying to fix this? And now that I'm years and years away from it, I don't have the excitement of those early days of like, oh my gosh, the kids were like, Madame, like, is it going to be like this every day? Like, what just happened? It was like they were living in real time, that shift. Now it's like, this is just the way it is. Right. This feels normal to everyone. But yeah, I do think just giving yourself the permission, like, I'm just going to try this once and see what happens. And again, maybe it's going to be a disaster. It's one day. And then, see what worked, what didn't work. And then maybe make yourself, in 2 weeks from now, I'm going to try something that builds on this and see what happens with that. And I do think that's a more sustainable way of making change. And like trying someone else's lesson, I took a lot of stuff directly from Lisa Shepard and just gave it to my students. And then once I understood more like, oh, this is why she asked that question first. This is the logic behind asking this. This is why there's some questions like this and some questions like that. Then it became part of my repertoire and I was able to actually write my own stuff. But initially, I really just needed to follow other people's examples to get comfortable.
I love that. And again, if you do you, right? If throwing out all of the stuff you've done before breaks that habit and makes you do something differently, then that's great too. Like I can see it both ways for sure. One of the things I like when I talk, there's a lot of things, and we're going to kind of veer a little just as a wrap up away from just talking about grammar, but when you classify yourself kind of as a proficiency based communicative language teacher, or however, how do you explain to people what you are as a teacher? That's a good question first.
Yeah, I don't know. That whole thing just seems to make people mad.
I know.
So
right?
I would say I teach thematic units. Our department only gives performance-based assessments. We do standards-based grading. The standards are the ACTFL levels. We assess by modes. Nothing else counts. Like the term grade is either 90 or 100% based on performance assessments. I use a lot of authentic resources, but not only.
I love it.
I think that's maybe as far as I would venture. I particularly like as someone who I don't have a degree in teaching. I don't have a degree in second language acquisition. I really came to this from another world. So I don't know. I'm not as like wrapped up in the terms.
Well, there's too many terms too. That's why when I started going down that path, I'm like, I don't want to really go down that path, like labeling and things. What I guess I'd like to say is, I know you and your team, and the people you work with, I've interviewed Tim before, and I know, so, and Barbara. And so what I think doing all of the things that you do, right, with the grammar and context and the thematic units and the performance assessments and all of those things, what I think is important for people to know is that there are a lot of things, right? There's so many things that if you're changing from a more legacy or traditional approach to language teaching and learning, sometimes it's totally overwhelming, right? And so I guess I guess I feel like anytime you make any sort of change, that it's easier to make other changes. Do you see that to be the case as well? So let's say whether you're approaching more comprehensible input or whether you're thinking about changing grammar, sometimes people rate these on like, this is more important, this is less important. Other than input is the most important thing that everybody needs to really do. And speaking that target language, I think everyone agrees, hands down, that's number one. Other than that, like whether or not you're assessing, proficiency, how you're grading, how you're teaching grammar, how you're doing thematic units, all of those. How do you feel about what, is important or, as far as where does grammar, in your opinion, kind of fit in, or does it even matter?
Right. I mean,
do you know what I'm asking?
There are so many
elements. What I'm asking?
And it was very interesting when I went to that Laura Terrell workshop. In my mind, it was about thematic units. And I remember asking her about it later and being like, Laura, once I started doing thematic units, then I had to completely change the way I assess. And then I had to start using different rubrics because I was doing everything by mode. And then that meant, and she was like, yes, I know. She's like, but we just call it thematic units because people can tolerate that. And it's a little more palatable. And I was like, oh, well, you got me. So good going. So I do think it's, your access point is your best place to start. So for me, my initial thing was I am only changing French 8. I am writing thematic units. I profoundly did not understand what input was. I saw in the keys to learning, you had to have input. I just thought it was what you wanted to put in the student's brain. Like today I want to put in the verb to be. I did not know what input was. And I taught like that for a few years. And then I was still teaching French 7 straight from the textbook, workbooks, CDs, blah, blah, blah. And at a certain point, I was like, this is madness. I can't be literally closing the tweets. And 4 minutes later, the 7th graders walk in and I'm like pressing, okay, exercise 4, And so then I made myself turn over the second course. And then the whole thing was turned over. And of course, when you do it the second time, it goes much better because you've made so many mistakes. I mean, my 8th grade curriculum, it's like a hot mess that will take all time to fix, because I wrote it when I did not know enough to be writing curriculum, and I wrote it alone, and it was, oh my gosh. Yeah. So I think you have to kind of start. And then the thing is, though, this is the trick, right? Is once you change one thing, it's impossible to keep everything else the same. So I'm just letting the cat out of the bag here. You can say to yourself, all I'm going to do is do my can-dos. But if you're really doing the can-dos, you're going to notice all these other things that like no longer fit what you're saying matters. And so the grammar is going to have to change, because it would be ridiculous, and so I don't even think it really matters where you start. And it's going to take forever, right? Like this, I'm telling you about 2015, every single year, there's some new layer of this that gets added, and everyone's coming in with a different strength. Like I came from a department, my previous department had expected 100% target language use. So I had a lot of experience with teaching in the target language and expecting that for my students. And we used rubrics. So I had those two things I kind of got. And when we came in, those were not my issues. I had absolutely no idea how to write a unit. I didn't even know how to write a lesson, because I was just teaching straight from the textbook every single day. That was much, much harder. So, everyone's going to come in with some solid pieces that they have and that they're going to continue to use. And then my sense is once you change one thing, it kind of snowballs, but it takes an awful long time. And some things you can't change for yourself, right? Like I was excited about changing what the curriculum looked like, but I was hearing, okay, we're not quite ready to do that at the high school. So can you also please still teach the things in the textbook until we're ready to make the big shift? Or like the way the grading system for the whole department worked, that came later.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's whatever your entry point is, grammar may not be it, whatever it might be, performance assessment, but you're right. I think they're very tied together. They're very, kind of woven together. So, but I love that. Any other advice, stories, anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like listeners to kind of think about as they might be thinking about how they've taught grammar in the past, how they've learned language in the past?
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say, like, I think we should not use up too much of our energy on our feelings about how we've taught in the past, because we're going to need all of our energy to think about how we want to teach into the future. And one of the beautiful things about our profession is that we do get new students every year, and most of them will never know what you did last year. You can reinvent yourself constantly. You can reinvent yourself over February vacation. You can,
love that.
And so there is that opportunity. And so I don't think I felt much more stuck than I actually was. I had a lot more freedom to make choices than I realized. And I just think every teacher, should feel the courage of their conviction, as Julia Child would say, to make some changes, to see what happens. Some things you're going to find yourself crawling back to your safe, happy place. And other times you're going to discover that you're totally fantastic at something you had never heard of a month ago. And so, I just encourage everyone to sort of, it can be a profession that's highly repetitive in some ways, but like, this is really, for me, at least, this was the chance to sort of have a renaissance and find myself in a whole new way. I don't think I would still be in teaching, and certainly not as excited about teaching as I am if I hadn't been through this process myself. So for me, it's been really a way to sort of look at everything with fresh eyes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for helping us to kind of talk about grammar with fresh eyes, as well as along with many other things that have been touched upon that happen in your classroom. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. And I'll put some of the things that you mentioned in the show notes. I'll put some information about PACE and, Lisa's website. We can link to that too. Do you have? I
can give you some of my sample lessons too.
Awesome. So, any of those resources you would like to share with listeners, we'll put those down in the notes. And thank you so much, Rebecca, and have a wonderful rest of your day.